Welcome to NovaraLIVE. Coming up tonight, Trump's lashing out at his NATO allies. A man intimidates Al Jazeera journalists in Golders Green and is found out to be a Met officer. The curious case of Morgan McSweeney's stolen phone. Does the left need a UK version of DOGE? And turns out you can cuck the Zuck, as he's been caught out in a social media addiction trial. I'm Helena, aka No Justice M to G, and tonight I'm delighted to be joined by Turn Left's Curtis Daly. Wario Bastani's in the house.
Wario Bastani's in the house. It's going to be a thing now you said it. I'm so delighted to be back here in the studio. Thursdays are cool. I like Thursdays.
Absolutely, absolutely. Unlike, I believe it's Ford Prefect in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I do get the hang of Thursdays eventually. If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. And as always, make sure to let us know your comments in the YouTube chat and indeed in the comments section after the show. Donald Trump has been using the caps lock button again, this time for another online tantrum about NATO and Iran. He posted this on Truth Social earlier today. NATO nations have done absolutely nothing to help with the lunatic nation now militarily decimated of Iran. The USA needs nothing from NATO, but never forget this very important point in time. President Donald J. Trump. NATO countries have, in fact, been very much involved in the war. NATO air defence has shot down 2 missiles entering Turkish airspace, for example. And countries, including the United Kingdom, are allowing the US to use their bases for bombing missions. Clearly, that's not enough for Trump, and NATO's Secretary General Mark Rutte seems keen to appease him.
We have seen with North Korea, if we negotiate for too long, you might pass the moment where you can still get this thing done. And North Korea now has the nuclear capability. If Iran would have the nuclear capability, including together with the missile capability, it would be a direct threat, an existential threat to Israel, to the region, to Europe, to the stability in the world. So the president doing this is crucial. And I've seen the polling, but I really hope the American people will be with him, because he is doing this to make the whole world safer.
But even as the alliance's leader lavishes Trump with praise for his illegal war, some member states are being less cooperative, at least rhetorically. This is what German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius had to say today.
To make it crystal clear, this war is a catastrophe for the world's economies. The impact is absolutely evident already now after a little bit more than 2 weeks. The closure of the Hormuz Strait has an impact for all the region in the Indo-Pacific, including Australia, but for most, especially for Japan, depending by more than 90% of imports via the Hormuz Strait. So this is a real impact.
If that's how the German government feels, you have to wonder why the country is helping the US military to attack Iran by giving it access to an airbase to coordinate drone and missile strikes. The defense minister is, however, correct to say that the global economy is in peril. The chief of the World Trade Organization, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, said earlier today that the war has caused the worst disruption to global trade in the past 80 years, and that the world order we're accustomed to has irrevocably changed. History buffs will of course know that 80 years ago is just after World War II ended. Now, if the British public were hoping Keir Starmer's deft leadership might help shield them from the oncoming collapse of the world order, forecasters have some disappointing news for them as well. It turns out that among the world's 20 biggest economies, the UK is set to suffer the most. Back in December, GDP growth was expected to be a modest 1.2%, but that's now fallen to 0.7% as the world braces for major energy shortages and significant inflation. So Keir Starmer has involved the UK in an illegal and unprovoked war that will make us all poorer, but at least we've earned the respect and gratitude of our special US allies, right?
They said, we'd love to send ships. They actually made a statement, a couple of them, that we want to get involved when the war is over. No, it's supposed to get involved when the war's beginning, or even before it begins. We had the UK say that we'll send, this is 3 weeks ago, we'll send our aircraft carriers, which aren't the best aircraft carriers, by the way. They're toys compared to what we have. But we'll send our aircraft carrier when the war is over. I said, oh, that's wonderful. Thank you very much. Don't bother. We don't need it. And we don't need it, and we don't need them.
Now, the epicenter of all this economic turmoil is, of course, the Strait of Hormuz, a crucial global shipping lane that Iran's navy has effectively closed. Earlier today, Israel claimed that it had killed the commander of the Iranian navy, Ali Reza Tangziri, in an airstrike. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz said Tangziri was directly responsible for mining and blocking the Strait of Hormuz. But even if the killing is confirmed, it's unlikely that this alone would lead to Iran losing control of the strait. Iran's military structure is highly decentralized, specifically so it can withstand losing members of its leadership. The killing of the country's supreme leader at the start of the war, along with other senior figures, has had little impact on Iran's ability to retaliate. On top of that, there's plenty of room for the global shipping crisis to get a lot worse. A leader from Yemen's Houthi movement has told Reuters that the group is ready to attack ships in the Red Sea on behalf of Iran. The Houthis caused major disruption between 2023 and last year by imposing a naval blockade on the waterway to punish Israel for its genocide in Gaza, all of which means it's looking increasingly unlikely that Trump will be able to bomb his way out of this crisis. He keeps insisting that Iran and the United States are negotiating for an end to the war and that Iran is begging for a deal. Iranian leaders, however, are projecting a different message about potential negotiations. They have dismissed a 15-point ceasefire plan from Trump and responded with their own demands, which include an end to the killing of Iranian officials and reparations for the war. Meanwhile, Ibrahim Raisi, a spokesperson for Iran's Commission on National Security and Foreign Policy, posted this on Twitter earlier today. Any negotiation with the devil is a strategic mistake. Let the missiles negotiate with Trump. It's difficult to dismiss these kind of statements as bluster. A report today from Iran's semi-official news agency, Tasnim, suggests the leadership is preparing for the war to escalate further. The agency quotes an unnamed military source who says the country is mobilizing 1 million fighters to resist a potential ground invasion by the United States. The military source said this: "The US wants to open the Strait of Hormuz with suicide and self-destructive tactics. That's fine. We are ready for both their suicide strategy to be executed and for the strait to remain closed." Curtis, it does seem like that the United States have snookered themselves, haven't they?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think this is very desperate from Donald Trump. We've spoken about this before. I think he's lost in his own hubris because he thinks, I can win this war very easily. And he's quickly finding out that Iran have prepared for this war for decades. Again, I've mentioned before how Netanyahu has said, Iran are going to build nukes. So you really think that Iran isn't prepared for us? Of course they are. I mean, they were bombed by Israel and America just last year. In terms of NATO not helping out in this war, I think is absurd. They're actually, I think, almost doing the Keir Starmer strategy, which is that Keir Starmer hasn't said, I'm going to be going full-throated into this war. I'm not going to do boots on the ground. But he's doing a sort of war by stealth, allowing our bases to be used. John Healey said our fighter jets can be sent over. And that's kind of the position of many NATO allies, what they're doing. I think it's very interesting that Trump has slapped on tariffs across Europeans, and now he's turning around and moaning that, we're not providing enough support. Now, granted, the US gives about $1 trillion a year in military spending for NATO, which is about 3.4% of GDP. It's a lot of money, but guess what? The US is the biggest military in the world. They've wreaked havoc, I think, the most across the world. They should pay up. But you've got the UK, who are the second biggest contributors with 2%, or 2.5%. Keir Starmer has signalled that he wants to increase our military spending to NATO to 3%. Germany have doubled their spending from 50 billion in 2022 to nearly 100 billion today. So, of course, many nations are putting in the money. But I guess what many people within NATO and NATO leaders understand is that, war isn't good. And I'm not saying this on a sort of humanitarian scale. I mean, NATO have been a very, I would say, an imperialist organisation in many aspects. It's not that they care about the people, but they're realising that actually living in a global economy, a global capitalist economy, it's not good that war breaks out. And they're realising that our economies are suffering. Now, a way to combat this is to have a more resilient economy, which we could be a bit more insular and protect our economy by building things in this country, for example, not always relying on imports and exports. And I'm not saying you should discount trade, but, I mean, take Russia, for example. In 2022, despite many experts, despite Joe Biden saying that Russia were going to suffer from these sanctions, they were resilient because they invested in their own economy. Now, of course, today is a little bit different. We've got French and the British now targeting oil tankers from Russia, the unflagged ones. But it just goes to show that when you have countries that are not resilient, that don't look after its own people or invest, you're going to be open up to global shocks. We've all seen when it comes to bills, for example, the price of oil has rocketed because we're reliant on this stuff. To go back to Trump, though, I think what he's trying to do is the whole NATO thing, which is that he made this point before, which is that America spends so much money and NATO gives nothing back, right? But of course, NATO doesn't give money back; they do it in defence. I don't think that in this particular instance, NATO has been a far more sensible role. And I know people might attack me for saying something nice about NATO. I have big criticisms of NATO, but they're not rushing into this war. Now, the strange thing in terms of rhetoric, I think, is the fact that Keir Starmer and maybe even NATO, the right wing have made these people out as sort of anti-war. And Keir Starmer's almost got away with it. Now, we know on the left that given that we are using our bases or exporting our bases for the US to use to attack Iran, that is being involved in the war. But he's managed to almost convince some people that he's not for this war. And he did rightly attack Reform, by the way, who have attacked him. Reform were all about this war. And Starmer says, look, I'm not being aggressive in this war. So I think the right wing have almost made Keir Starmer look better in that instance, and possibly the same for NATO.
I mean, it is very frustrating to me that the constant line from the Trump administration is this idea that, oh, well, NATO owe us so much, we've done so much investment. I believe it's still only about 3.8% of GDP that America spends on defence, right, if I'm correct in that same statement. So they don't spend that much more as a percentage of GDP than other NATO countries do, right? It's only a couple of percentage points here or there. And it's also the implication that somehow NATO is something that the United States invests in purely out of the benevolence of its own heart. Oh, we are doing our military spending for you, which is why America has no universal health care or any kind of welfare state, right? When in reality, of course, is that NATO has been America's a kind of extension of its military capacity that it uses for economic reasons, for geostrategic reasons. At the very least, you could call this a symbiotic relationship, where America get access to all of these countries for defense purposes, and then they get access to America defensively as well, in geostrategic terms. But in reality, in my mind, this is a kind of an extension of the American imperial project that keeps America, or keeps Europe yoked to America, rather than the other way around.
Yeah, I mean, NATO is a capitalist imperialist project by and large, and the US has benefited very well from this. And Donald Trump clearly doesn't understand that. And I think it does go back to the self-confidence of him and people around him who think because we are the mightiest force with the biggest military, we can go in and just destroy other nations and not realize that there's also a strategic element to it. And NATO has been very strategic in the way it has pushed its imperialism through via the US. And it's a very important ally for Trump. But Trump doesn't seem to get that. But I mean, this is the same guy who said, we won the war. Oh, wait, actually, we didn't win the war. Oh, we don't need NATO's help or anyone's help. Oh, actually, why is no one helping? And that was all in the space of a minute.
I mean, that's true. We have seen the transcript of showing Trump's opinion on what's happening in Iran. Suddenly we're winning, but also we're going to be getting a ceasefire, but also we're doing this investment, getting these people on the ground. It seems to be an incredibly muddled position that he's got himself in. But then again, he's trying to appeal to a base of people, as far as he can see, who also want to destroy Iran, but also really want America first as well. So I don't think he can really get his position straight without pissing some people off.
I wonder how strong that base is, though. I think broadly people are anti-war. Remember in the election, and the GOP and Donald Trump were so focused on trying to be the anti-war campaign. They were actually attacking Kamala Harris for being pro-war. They did that. The GOP had social media posts saying, we're not going to drag you into another war. And I think, look, let's be honest, a lot of MAGA people are in a cult. I mean, they supported Trump if he's anti-war, they support if he's pro-war. But I don't know who he's really speaking to, because again, broadly, people don't support this war. A poll came out that showed a significant portion, maybe the majority of Americans, believe that Trump has done this war to hide from the Epstein files and distract from it. People can see that. And then, of course, added on top the increase in bills, people are going to understand their material reality has got worse due to war. So in a way, the political operation from Trump and the people around him, I don't think they're even concerned about their base anymore. They just have the power and just want to do what they want.
That's true. And of course, they've been dragged into this by Israel as well. So
of course,
whether their base wants it or not, Netanyahu unfortunately has the final say.
If Israel wants it,
as far as the Trump administration is concerned. The scandal over the appointment of Peter Mandelson has dragged this government's reputation into the gutter, at least according to veteran MP John McDonnell anyway. And it shows no signs of going away anytime soon, as Labour figures have been forced by the Commons to release all of their private communications with the disgraced former US ambassador and friend of the notorious sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein. Health Secretary Wes Streeting voluntarily released some of his own to the public earlier this year, although he's claiming something quite different now.
Do you have disappearing messages on your WhatsApp? Do you send your messages to the department as per the rules for government ministers?
Yes, I do have disappearing messages. I also, routinely make sure that when I'm getting incoming from people, whether it's a member of parliament asking me to look into something, or whether it's someone contacting me about something that's health and social care related, that I then relay that to and through the Department of Health and Social Care. We also publish transparency returns in terms of the meetings that we have, including meetings with journalists. There are standards of transparency and accountability. Those things matter.
Okay, so he had disappearing messages on his WhatsApp, according to his first statement and the little clip we watched, but also managed to produce all of those WhatsApps of Peter Mandelson that he released publicly and shared many months of them with Beth Rigby. Bit of a weird situation. Don't know how those correlate with each other, but apparently we're going to be having higher levels of transparency moving forward. Kate McCann then asked Wesley about another high-profile figure embroiled in the Mandelson files.
So what happened in Morgan McSweeney's case? Because his phone, very, very senior member of the government team, his phone was stolen. It was unlocked. The police failed to investigate, of course. But there is a concern. None of his messages were backed up. That's against the rules. Can you confirm that there's an investigation into how that happened and to ensure that no one else is in that situation currently?
Well, I suspect that off the back of this, there will be a reiteration of the expectations on ministers, special advisors and officials, so that people are clear on the rules and expectations. People will want to tighten up on those fronts inevitably. As for Morgan McSweeney's individual case, those are questions for him to answer. I would just say, and I can totally understand the cynicism in these sorts of cases, but do bear in mind that when his phone was stolen, it was reported to the police at the time, and he couldn't at that stage have known that Parliament would ask for the publication of all messages in the way that they have, in quite an unprecedented way. And so, yes, sometimes in politics, things can be explained as a result of conspiracy. In other times, and more often than not, it is a result of cock-up rather than conspiracy.
So let's scrutinise the timeline of this supposed cock-up, shall we? The key date in question is September the 9th. This was when the first revelations around the nature of Mandelson and Epstein's relationship became public knowledge, when the full Epstein birthday book was released by the House Oversight Committee, along with emails between the two from 2008 after Epstein's conviction on child sex offences, which kicked off the furious debate about Mandelson's role as ambassador and led to him being dismissed on September the 11th. So what will be important is to clarify whether or not McSweeney's phone was lost before or after this date, which was asked of the Housing Secretary Steve Reed by Lewis Goodall earlier this week.
Morgan McSweeney's phone has disappeared with many of his messages to Lord Mandelson on it, and no backup exists. Well, you do understand why many people will find that very convenient.
Well, as I understand it, that was a theft that was reported months before the whole Mandelson situation even began.
No backup. Prime Minister's Chief of Staff has no backup of his messages.
Well, I don't know what he does or doesn't have in terms of
doesn't seem ideal, does it?
But his phone was stolen, and he reported it at the time, and it was well in advance of anything happening around the Mandelson situation.
I remember when Boris Johnson's phone All the WhatsApp mysteriously disappeared on that. I remember Labour shadow ministers being pretty incredulous.
Yes, and that happened after he had been required to provide it. Morgan reported the theft of his phone months, I think it was maybe even over a year before the whole situation arose, so there's no comparison.
Well, it's all cleared up then, isn't it? Or not. As it turns out, Steve Reed is totally incorrect. It is now being reported by Times political editor Stephen Swinford that the date it was reported stolen was October the 20th, not the year before, as Steve Reed suggested there, not even months before, but over a month after Mandelson had been dismissed. The convenience of the stolen phone was also put to Prime Minister Keir Starmer this morning by Beth Rigby.
Critics say that the theft and botched investigation of your former Chief of Staff Morgan McSweeney's phone stinks of a cover-up. Can you understand why people are suspicious about his phone being stolen just as the Mandelson scandal was unfolding?
Well, the phone was stolen. It was reported to the police. There's a transcript of the call in which Morgan McSweeney gives his name, his date of birth, the details of the phone, and the police confirm that it was reported. Unfortunately, there are thefts like this. It was stolen, it was reported at the time, and the police have acknowledged and confirmed that that is what happened. And the idea that somehow everybody could have seen that sometime in the future there would be a request for the phone is, to my mind, a little bit far-fetched.
He makes a perfectly good point. No one could possibly have predicted months in advance that the opposition would have passed a humble address that mandates the release of McSweeney's WhatsApp messages. Or could they? Here's an excerpt from an article earlier this year by Tim Shipman, collating statements from Labour insiders over the course of Starmer's time in office. In September last year, it emerged that Mandelson's relationship with the paedophile Jeffrey Epstein was embarrassingly deep and enduring. After backing him in Parliament, Starmer fired him from the following day. At that point, it can now be revealed many in Number 10 thought McSweeney was toast. The Commons rose for the conference recess, not returning until October the 13th. Over that period, a team of advisors and officials from the Cabinet Office, the Labour Whip's office, and the office of the Leader of the House prepared, in case the Tories used their first opposition day after the recess, to submit a humble address motion seeking disclosure of all the email and WhatsApp exchanges covering Mandelson's appointment and after his resignation. Those involved told colleagues, if the Tories pass a humble address motion, Morgan is fucked. By the time Parliament returned on October the 13th, the government was embroiled in an entirely different row about the collapse of the China spying case. By the time the first opposition day came round on October the 28th, the leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch's team, had forgotten all about the row over Mandelson's communications with McSweeney and focused their attention on the spying case instead. So that is a direct quote, apparently, according to Tim Shipman, from a Labour insider saying that if there was to be a humble address, then Morgan was fucked. And this were conversations that we're having after the revelations, but before all of the bravado happened with regards to the humble address that had actually been passed. So Keir Starmer's statement there that he made to Sky News was that, or the idea that there would have been this humble address that would have revealed all of these communications in such an unprecedented way, no one could have predicted this. I'm like, well, Tim Shipman's article certainly claims people predicted it to the point at which they even knew the person most likely to be implicated in those messages could have been Morgan McSweeney. He's, of course, the mothership as far as the Labour Party are concerned. They certainly see him as being someone who was, at least at the time, integral to Keir Starmer's leadership. That's how it looks like to me, given that he seemed to be the one making all of the decisions at the time. So I don't seem to see how Keir Starmer's statement comports with what is being reported by Tim Shipman. It does seem a bit odd that those two things can coexist to me. But surely, of course, the transcript of the call which Keir Starmer mentions there to the police totally absolves McSweeney. Well, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but in the transcript, McSweeney does not state that he is the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff and potentially the most powerful man in the country. He claims to have had the phone unlocked and texting at the time of the theft, when his phone has private communications with the Prime Minister potentially open, and we think there'd be pertinent information to notify the police of. And on top of this, the transcript shows the name of the street where the incident occurred as being entered incorrectly. Belgrave Street in Tower Hamlets instead of Belgrave Road in Pimlico, which of course, absolutely, these things can happen when you're in a rush. Except, the transcript also shows McSweeney confirming to the operator that the thief then ran left past Stepney Green Park, which is in Tower Hamlets and not in Pimlico. Zoink, Scoob! Can you really untangle this mystery, Curtis?
I am utterly unconvinced, shall I say. I don't buy it whatsoever. I mean, following this story, my initial thoughts were, okay, Morgan McSweeney didn't know this was going to happen, so this is just a coincidence that his phone was stolen. Now, if I were to put myself in his shoes, I really don't want to, but if I have to, I would look at the news and see that Peter Mandelson is being investigated, and then think, well, I've got messages with Peter Mandelson on my phone. Even if you weren't notified of an investigation coming, you probably would think maybe my phone could be used for evidence. And again, I can't say whether this is absolute or not, but it does seem like potentially, he rung at the police and said his phone was stolen, and that's an alibi to say they couldn't receive the messages. But there's many different things that's going on here. One, why do you have messages on one phone with such important correspondence? Apparently, the cabinet do have some messages, but not all of it. But why on one phone? And two, he didn't even say it was Morgan McSweeney calling up. Imagine calling up the police and saying, I've had a phone stolen. I'm just John Doe, though. Like, you're shadow prime minister, let's be honest, right? You're shadow prime minister and you're not going to mention that? That's completely crazy to me. Now, in terms of Keir Starmer, again, we are not in his minds. We're not there. I guess we have to be careful what we say. But Keir Starmer seems to think that he had no idea about any of these sort of investigations. Well, we've got excerpts here from articles saying that, well, a Labour insider absolutely knew this was going to happen, literally said that Morgan McSweeney was fucked. So we're now supposed to believe that the Prime Minister didn't know any shenanigans with Morgan McSweeney and Peter Mandelson. With Peter Mandelson. And I'm just utterly convinced by all of this. We were promised, not that any of us believe it, but we were promised a competent government. In the 2024 general election, the election wasn't a battle between ideas, policy, and ideology. It was basically, we're the adults in the room, elect us, we're not going to be incompetent, like the last guys, the Conservatives. We're not going to be scandal-ridden. We're going to manage the country better. And I knew that was rubbish at the time. I'm not being big-headed, but I knew that it was going to be scandal-ridden. One, because I think the ideology of privatisation, either pro-austerity or not really a meaningful enough opposition to austerity, breeds incompetence. When you're pushing policies that people don't want, you're going to have an incompetent government. Where I am shocked is the amount of scandals. And it's scandals in which that feels like they've been... they didn't need to fall for these particular scandals, or rather they were self-imposed scandals. And it shows how politically inept Keir Starmer, Morgan McSweeney, and the entire Labour government is. Now, granted, even if a scandalous government had issues with a phone going missing, with messages with Peter Mandelson, and obviously links to the most notorious paedophile, no one's going to really buy it anyway. But on top of that, when you've got a government that has lied so many times, that has engaged in so many U-turns, people are not going to fall for it. So yes, I remain utterly unconvinced. And the final caveat here is that I'm getting these names mixed up. Morgan McSweeney pushed for Peter Mandelson to be appointed as ambassador. Like, he was his biggest cheerleader. And we're supposed to buy what they're saying? I'm sorry. I'm not convinced.
After the arson attack on ambulances owned by a Jewish charity in Golders Green on Monday, a group of people confronted an Al Jazeera journalist.
Now you can go. Go take your briefcase, go take your Al Jazeera equipment and go. No one needs Al Jazeera here. No one wants Al Jazeera over here.
You don't decide. Go back to Qatar.
Of course.
You represent an entity that has questionable motives, and by association.
امشي من هون يا حمار. امشي من هون.
Oh, you will be moved.
No. Don't be violent. امشي من هون يا حمار. I'm calm. امشي من هون. امشي من هون يا حمار يا كلب يا كلب روح من هون لا مالو ما تعوسه انا لا خمر انت خمر اني خمر I'm walking.
It turns out that the man in the grey hoodie there, who called the journalist a dog and told him to go back to Qatar, is a Metropolitan Police officer. The investigative outlet Declassified UK has identified the man as Special Constable David Soffer. Sofer appears to be a staunch supporter of Israel, whose military has killed multiple Al Jazeera journalists while covering the genocide in Gaza, along with members of their families. He also seems to be a fan of far-right agitator Tommy Robinson. In 2024, Robinson shared a graphic on Twitter that said "fuck Palestine" and wrote, "The shithole is full of inbred Islamist parasites and terrorists." Sofer replied to the post to say that Robinson is telling the truth and that Israel would justly finish what it started in Gaza, according to Declassified's report. But it's not just a few bad apples at the Met with a questionable stance on Palestine. Yesterday, the force announced that it will be continuing to arrest people who express support for Palestine action, even though the High Court has ruled that the ban on the group is unlawful. When making the ruling in February, the court said that the ban would remain in place during the appeals process. But at the time, the Met said they wouldn't make any new arrests. Now, though, they're saying that they've revised their approach from the interim position that they took after the ruling. This is what Assistant Deputy Commissioner James Harman said about the U-turn. That means it is still a criminal offence to support Palestine action. We must enforce the law as it is at the time, not as it might be at a future date. We must do that consistently and without fear or favour. The campaign group Defend Our Juries, which has organised sustained protests against the ban, was quick to question the logic of this statement, and they said something else. The ban on Palestine action is ruled currently unlawful. Right now, nothing says clear guidance like regularly changing your mind over the unlawful arrests of thousands of peaceful protesters for holding paper signs. The Court of Appeal is set to hear the government's case against the ruling at the end of April, but the Met has said the case could last many months. That means the police force may well have to endure even more damage to its reputation by continuing to arrest elderly people and people with disabilities as they peacefully oppose the ban. Defend Our Juries has already announced a protest in London for next month. And again, Curtis, it does seem to me that it's an incongruent position. They're saying, oh, well, we can't police based upon what we think it'll be at a future date. But we have a current ruling now, as far as I can see, that the issue is that what could change in future is that ruling could then be overturned by the Court of Appeal. I mean, I'm not a legal expert, I'm not a policing expert, but it does seem to me like the interim position that they're talking about there was far more of a reasonable position to take when you know that there is at least some amount of ambiguity over what the actual law states in regard to whether or not the Palestine action can be banned lawfully under terrorism legislation. What do you think?
I don't think you need to be a legal expert or a police expert to understand that you just follow the current court ruling. The court ruled that banning Palestine Action supporters and arresting these people was deemed unlawful. And it wasn't that, oh, from now on, it's unlawful. It was retrospective. So all of the thousands of people that are arrested, all those lovely old grannies holding up signs peacefully protesting a genocide, that was deemed unlawful. And at least the Met Police could say, right, this new court ruling has happened, we're going to go with this guidance. That was the sensible thing to do. And now they've basically changed, seemingly on a whim, that actually, no, we are going to make these arrests now. What, based on a future prediction? That's not what we want. We don't want policing based on vibes or potentially the future. We want our police to be policing on logic and what the law says. Of course, that would be assuming that we have a non-corruptible police force in this country. I mean, that's not the case. Of course, the Met Police has been found to be institutionally sexist and racist. In terms of the Al Jazeera journalist being assaulted, I think the correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the officer called him a dog, which is absolutely disgraceful. I think he needs to go. This wasn't just some random person who was getting really, really angry. This is a member of the police force. And at least the idea of the police is to protect everyone. And again, I'll point to the institutional racism and sexism that shows that's not the case. But that's the idea behind it. Look, I do have to point out this double standards here. If this was a Muslim man who did that, you would hear the right-wing media cry that this is a no-go zone, that people can't do journalism and it's being taken over by the Muslims. I have to point that double standard out there because this isn't really being covered that widely. I mean, independent media circles, a bit of mainstream media, but right-wing shows are not eating this up as they would. So I think that's something to think about. What I think the behaviour from the police and why they've decided to start saying we're going to arrest these people again is I think it's downstream from our government policy, which is our government policy is to support Israel. We are still enabling a genocide. We're still sending arms. We're still funding them. And that kind of tells people within British society that this is still okay. And I think if you're working for the state, i.e. as a police officer, you're kind of told that, you know what, it's enabled actually that you can behave in this way, think this certain way, because our government policy basically says it's okay to do so. I do think if our government policy was a just one, in which we said we're not sending any weapons to Israel, we are going to call them out on their genocide, then maybe the behaviour might be different. I can't guarantee that, of course, but I do think that the behaviour from the police is all downstream from that. Finally, this particular officer, you know, he shared or he replied to Tommy Robinson on social media. Tommy Robinson was saying some foul and disgusting things about Muslims. And this guy was like, yeah, you're right. This is the truth. Again, this is a public servant. They should absolutely not be in that position if they're doing that. People will have personal opinions, right? You cannot be displaying that on social media when you're part of the Met Police. I think he needs to go.
I mean, can you imagine what the furore would be like online if the kind of statements that Tommy Robinson made about Palestinians were made about Jewish people, and some ethnic minority officer echoed those same statements, right? Instant scandal. There would be an instant level to which they would be demanded to be sacked, and rightly so. Yeah, and rightly so. But yet when it's the same kind of racism displayed against Palestinians, we don't seem to see any kind of reaction to that outside of, you know, declassified and obviously, of course, now us and people on the internet. Why do you think that is?
I think it's baked in with the hierarchy of racism. We've all seen that now, and I'm glad people are waking up to the hierarchy of racism. It doesn't mean that anti-Semitism doesn't matter. What it means is, and in my personal view, I think Zionism is anti-Semitic because you've got so many people who will throw anti-Zionist Jews under the bus, attack them for not being pro-Israel enough, right? I think a lot of the people, you know, I saw a clip of Julia Hartley-Brewer decrying anti-Semitism over the art gallery, and I'm just thinking, I don't think you're concerned about anti-Semitism. You're concerned about your pro-Israel angle. And I think that's why we would see a very different response if it was against a person of color or a Palestinian or a Muslim. Because again, the hierarchy of racism is baked into our institutions. It's baked into our media. And by the way, that Sofer, the officer, people are claiming it was never a police officer. He was. He just removed his job as at the Met Police from LinkedIn. He's trying to now hide it.
Well, there we go. Again, the hierarchy of racism doesn't seem to ever go away in this country. Who remembers hearing stuff like this throughout the whole of the 2010s?
We think, compared with the last government, we think they were putting up taxes too much and not looking at how to find efficiencies in spending enough. So what we're doing, starting today with identifying these £6 billion of savings in current year spending, is saying we've got to try and cut out waste in terms of spending more so we can keep taxes down. That is the whole point of what we're doing to stop this national insurance rise, which had actually been, otherwise was going to come in next year. So we're going to work really hard to make sure that the money government spends, your money, taxpayers' money, we're going to get more efficiency for that.
It's been the clarion call of the right wing since time immemorial. Government is uniquely wasteful and inefficient, so we need to cut it to unleash the private sector. This wasn't just used as a justification for privatisation, although we've all seen the consequences of what efficiency savings look like for private sector companies when sewage is being dumped into our rivers and Royal Mail plan on cutting second-class delivery days. It was also used as a justification for hollowing out state capacity in services that it still runs. Ever since the neoliberal turn in the 1980s, the canard is that the private sector is of course naturally more efficient, and it's been used as a justification for outsourcing via public contract or private finance initiative. It's led to some absolutely absurd states of affairs. School PFI contracts left uncompleted, fast-track pandemic tendering for Michelle Moan's PPE MedPro, NHS being overcharged huge amounts for basic services, the ignominy of the Post Office Horizon scandal, or some unbelievable road maintenance contracts that have created what are known as shadow tolls, where private contractors get to leech money from the public purse for decades after work that was done sometimes as far back as the 1990s. Which makes you think, wouldn't it have just been cheaper for the government to do all of this? Well, one popular New York City politician seems to think so.
As someone who believes deeply in the responsibility of government to deliver for working class people, I also believe it's our responsibility to deliver a government that's efficient, with every single dollar being put to the best possible use. That's why 2 months ago, I asked agencies across city government to find $1.7 billion in savings, without compromising essential services. Here are just a few things we've found so far. Even just by capping how much we spend on paper, pens, and office supplies, we're going to save more than $27 million. The The city was paying for a lot of work from outside contractors that was costing us far too much. So we're bringing a lot of that work in-house and saving our budget millions on things like IT services and software. We've also found that sometimes we've been overcharged for life-saving medicine, like naloxone. So we're renegotiating that contract and saving another $1 million. Our contract with McKinsey at the Department of Social Services? No more. That's $9 million that we won't be spending next year. The city rents lots of property it doesn't actually need. So we're going to shrink our physical footprint and save millions on leases. And we want to make sure that the programs we're delivering to New Yorkers are being used as intended. So we're going to strengthen verification to ensure that homeowners getting tax breaks are actually living in that home. This adds up to another $13 million a year. You've heard me say this time and again. In fighting a $5.4 billion fiscal deficit, we need to tax the rich and end the drain that's been our relationship with the state for far too long. As we pursue that, though, we also have to take a close look at our own spending and cut waste wherever we can. When we're looking to put our city back on firm financial footing, no saving is too small. We'll keep you posted every step of the way, because to deliver public goods, you have to first deliver public excellence.
Money that was previously being spaffed away into the pockets of the private sector, whether it be on rents or consultancy spend or outsourced IT systems work, will now no longer be used to pad shareholder dividends, but used solely in the delivery of public services, meaning cuts won't have any impact on service provision. And this is all under the auspices of a $6 billion deficit left to Mamdani by Eric Adams. If Mamdani were already operating under a balanced budget, these savings could have been used to provide even more services too. One of the most interesting parts of Mamdani's video, however, is calling out the consultancy McKinsey directly. Something that has plagued governments internationally has been the hollowing out of state skills by outsourcing even the decision-making of government to the private sector. This is the central argument put forward in the book The Big Con by economists Mariana Mazzucato and Rosie Collington, which calls out politicians directly in having been infantilized by having their work done for them by consultancies. Mazzucato herself explained this in an interview she gave to Novara's own Aaron Bastani on our Downstream podcast.
The infantilizes our governments, but came from a quote by a Tory, so conservative Lord Agnew, who during COVID, on the back of all the contracts that he was witnessing that the government was using to bring in consultants, you might remember that Deloitte was charged with the test and trace system, but also with Brexit, lots of money went to consultants. He said, oh my God, we are infantilizing Whitehall. In other words, if we keep outsourcing the role of government, we will stop learning. We will actually become like babies who haven't learned yet. We won't be doing, so we're not learning by doing. And this is actually something I've been talking about for decades. So I was very, not surprised, but it was very interesting that it was actually coming from the conservative side of government, because it's not necessarily intuitive that that's where it would have come from.
The numbers here are really impressive in terms of the growth, and it's something I'm pulling out of the book. This isn't my own personal research. This is so memorable as a fact. When Margaret Thatcher becomes Prime Minister in 1979, the British state is spending £6 million a year on consultants. When she leaves in 1990, so we're talking 30 years plus, 246 million.
Yeah.
So it's gone up more than 40 times.
Yeah.
And it's obviously gone up considerably more than then. This is hardly shrinking the state, is it?
If you look at kind of a more conservative, in quotes, neoliberal government, you might intuitively think they want to reduce state investment and bring in the private sector, both through privatization, but also consultification of government. So that figure you just mentioned from 6 to 246 million is part of that. But then there's two questions. One, the one you just said, that cost a lot of money. So in terms of actual expenditure by the state, it didn't necessarily reduce it. But was that really the point of Thatcher's government? I would argue no. It was actually to dismantle, in some ways, the ambition of the state or the structures of the state. And by bringing in consultants, regardless of how much it costs, and it cost a lot, you are helping to render the state actually in some ways weaker.
We'll link the full interview in the description. It is definitely well worth your time listening to it in full. What she points out, though, is very interesting. Not only does outsourcing feed into the ideological mind of private sector efficiency, it also feeds the political economy of neoliberalism that shovels public money into private hands for the opposite reason, to degrade services so badly that privatization becomes inevitable. It also helps the empty politics of the modern Conservative Party, who never believed in the state in the first place, to outsource their own departmental roles to Deloitte, and then they themselves can focus on campaigning rather than on governing. Well, surely the advice these consultancies provide is invaluable, surely. Well, let's start with McKinsey's contract with New York City. They were initially given $1.6 million to research trash cans, and they delivered, drumroll please, wheelie bins. Yes, that's right. McKinsey were paid $1.6 million to tell Eric Adam that maybe wheelie bins would solve his city's trash problems. And just to confirm, not a single cent went into actually buying any of the bins, just to McKinsey for the idea of having wheelie bins. Money well spent. This is the same consultancy, by the way, that was fined $650 million over advising Purdue Pharma to turbocharge the sales of the drug OxyContin during the opioid crisis. To make sure Deloitte isn't let off the hook with all of this stuff, though, they were forced to refund the Australian government when it was found that they submitted a report on the Australian welfare system that included multiple AI hallucinations in data provided or in the footnotes and references. Raw private sector efficiency on show. What is interesting is that this was a problem that was identified by the Labour Party before they entered government.
We will slash government consultancy spending, which has almost quadrupled in just 6 years. Now, consultants can play an important role, but taxpayers must get value for money. So we will introduce tough new rules. If a government wants to bring in consultants, they must demonstrate value for money. And if they cannot, that request will be denied. We will aim to cut consultancy spending in half over the next Parliament.
So how have they been getting on in government? In the first 2 quarters of their time in office, consultancy spend actually went up, according to the Financial Times, from $638 million in the first half of the year to $837 million in the second, which is in turn an increase of $200 million on the second half of 2023 and $350 million on the second half of 2022. Shows how little the party prepared for government, doesn't it? When they have to outsource even more of their own decision-making rather than having a pre-prepared prospectus for government. The Public Accounts Committee in government had also raised similar concerns. The data on how much departments spend on external consultants are inconsistent. The latest estimate by HM Treasury was $1.36 billion in 2022-2023, but other sources put the figure at as much as $2.23 billion. Government seems unconcerned at the many and obvious inaccuracies in its own data on the potential billions in taxpayer money that departments are spending on consultants. The PAC's report finds that departments are not complying with Cabinet Office directives on consultancy spend, and that their compliance in this area goes unmonitored. The PAC's report calls for a list of which departments are not complying with Cabinet Office requests on consultancy procurement, and a detailed breakdown of what each department spends on individual private contractors, categorised by the type of service. Now, if the left can't make the argument on how best to get value from public money, we'll end up leaving the door open for more rhetoric from people like Trump and Reform UK with their own DOGE departments. And it is both in their failures of both reform in terms of local councils and indeed Trump in the administration in the United States, which has provided economist and Green Party member James Meadway with the impetus to think that the left could potentially beat the right at their own game. He set up a new think tank called Verdant, and they've recently released a report around government waste that touches on a lot of what we've talked about here, and it has a recommendation for Office for Public Excellence as a sort of DOGE corollary. He's also recommended creating an ambitious government consultancy function to keep the skills in-house for generations to come rather than outsourcing them, a crackdown on government outsourcing more broadly, and even a potential nationalisation plan of BAE systems as a way for the state to get more bang for its buck. In the wake of reforms, local authority DOGE proving that you actually can't really cut DEI to save money, and Trump's DOGE costing more in lost tax than what it saved in the slashed aid it was giving to the poor, should be winning this argument on the left, Curtis? Or do you think there should be some potential pitfalls in a strategy like that?
I'm going to start off with my criticisms and then I'm going to go on to the praise. My criticism is the worry in which you are almost fighting reform and the right on their own terrain. I'm not sure if I'm particularly comfortable with the idea of the left DOGE. Because, look, I think Zach Palansky, in his leadership over the last 6 months, has gone a long way to tell the people that the government isn't like a household budget. And by the way, I'm not saying that Verdant or James Media is saying that, and I'll get onto that in a second, but he's come a long way to describe how our economy works, right? It's the issues when it comes to our economy is obviously managing inflation, for example, right? Not running out of money. And I think the danger is you're reinforcing that. And when you do that, the right wing then come in and say, well, all these programs the left wing want to do, they're just going to bankrupt this country, which they do now. And I think it's important for the left to try and take control of the narrative, but rewrite the narrative on how the economy works, which is, look, not just spend endless amount of money. Modern monetary theorists don't say that. Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth, fantastic read, by the way. I recommend people reading it. But it does say there are limits, of course, when it comes to the capacity of the economy and when it comes to inflation, right? And use taxes not as a way to bring in money to the treasury, but to reduce inequality. And I think if we go on that sort of left DOGE thing, we'll be bogged down with trying to spend money smartly rather than talk about the issue of inequality. Now, James Meadwell, I'm not going to attack him, by the way. I think he's great. He was on our show a couple of weeks ago. But I did note that he retweeted that Mamdani video, which, by the way, Mamdani, like, 1,000,000% Riz. I could never get the Riz he does. But the difference, and Meadway was praising Mamdani, saying this is what the left needs to do. The difference is that Mamdani is New York mayor. He doesn't have a central bank behind him. It's akin to a council, right? You have a certain budget and you have to be responsible with that. So Mamdani has to be responsible with the money, and he's doing very good things, and the way he's campaigning on it is brilliant. But our government economy is not like that in the same way. So I think that's really important. Now, in terms of policy and what they're pushing for, I don't have a critique, because it is absolutely right that we are the government is bloated and we are wasting money on private contracts and giving basically public wealth to private hands. That's absolutely true. I just think the framing should be based on fairness and how we're being ripped off by the oligarchs rather than it being a sort of DOGE thing. Now, what Mariana Mazzucato said, again, she's also fantastic when she calls the politicians childlike and infantile, infantilization of them. It's absolutely true, because the caliber of politicians today is very different than 50 years ago. Today, politicians don't want to govern. They want us to give them power, and then they export their power to the market and then just sit on their asses and do nothing. There's no politicians anymore that are taking the initiative and looking at good governance and what the government can do for the benefit of society. So that is also a problem. Neoliberalism has been described by many on the left for a long, long time as rolling back the state, and I don't think that's quite accurate. That, to me, seems more of classical or classic liberalism. Neoliberalism loves spending money. In fact, we're spending more than we ever have. To give an example, during the Obama era, the North Dakota Access Pipeline, that was running through local communities. And of course, that was transporting oil across the nation, made loads of private industry, loads of money. And why this links to neoliberalism is those who are being affected by that pipeline in that area were standing up, were protesting it, as is their right, and the government went in and basically armed and protected the pipeline. That's not leaving things to the market. That's the government actively spending money to protect private interests. That needs to be pointed out, because it's absolutely true that neoliberalism is about spending state money to protect private capital. And I think it's absolutely true that we should say we need to stop doing this. We need to get that money put in the hands of ordinary people, stop sucking up to the 1% and start working for the 99%. I think we can do that, but maybe not leaning into the sort of DOGE thing. Now, granted, I would say in the public consciousness, most people still think the economy is like a household budget. And can we convince the populace before 2029 general election that actually the economy isn't like that? I understand that's probably a tall order to convince people that that's not how the economy works. But I do think that maybe my role and other people's role in left media or just independent media can continue to make that argument that we can't run out of money physically, but of course, there are other constraints such as like inflation.
I think the angle that I would want to go with here is this idea from the 1980s, right? There's the Ronald Reagan quote, the very famous one. It's like, the worst thing to hear is, I'm the government and I'm here to help, or something along those lines, right? And that's been kind of cemented into the public conscious ever since. People look at the government and they think it's failing. They look at councils, and there's a very famous video of James Buckley from the Inbetweeners on a podcast saying, why is my council taking more money off me? Why is council tax going up? But waste collection, like I think it was garden waste collection, that had been cut, and you had to do that yourself. Right, but the services are going down, even though the amount of tax you're paying is going up. And broadly, finding a way of being able to blame private contractors for this, when, of course, a lot of money is being wasted on this stuff, is a good framework to be able to sell a narrative to the country as to why this thing's happening. Trying to sell them on aging populations and geopolitics is far harder to do so than just, we're wasting money on consultancies and on privatisation, right? Like, it used to be all done in-house in councils. It's why the potholes don't get filled, because it's all privatised, it's all outsourced. And that's a good story. It's a very good story to tell people that actually, it's this privatisation that means that government doesn't work in your eyes. That's a deliberate choice. Whereas if we do these things that's being outlined in Verdant's report, or with what Mamdani was doing in New York City, you can go to the country and say, look, I understand you don't have the belief that the government can come in and make your life better. You do not believe fundamentally that the government being here to help will end up with good ends at the end of the day. And it's the left's responsibility to be able to not only show that when they do win, but find a narrative to get to the position where they can have the levers of office to be able to do those things. And that's what's really important. So you look at, for example, like I mentioned in the piece there, there's the thing called shadow tolls. I don't know if you know about these things, Curtis. So on a stretch of the A1M, I think it's near Peterborough, there is what's known as a shadow toll. It's run by what's called a DBFO contract. That's design, build, finance, operate, where the government essentially in the 1990s went to a private company and said, you build, you maintain this stretch of the A1M. You can calculate how many cars go across there every day, and we'll pay you a percentage of the national road tax revenue based upon how many cars use it, right? So you're getting a toll, but it's not being paid by the users, it's being paid broadly by road tax. And whilst it costs them a certain amount to be able to build it, almost 4 times as much as what they initially paid and what they have paid in maintenance costs has been paid back to them in terms of shadow tolls. And if the government had done this, they would have borrowed money at a lower rate, because the government is the borrower that can do it at the best value, whether it is by, using the power of monetary financing under an MMT framework, but even under a Keynesian framework as well, if you're issuing bonds, it's still better value. And we wouldn't be paying through the nose year after year after year after year to essentially line the pockets of the shareholders of this company that did it in the first place. Shout out to Auto Shenanigans, by the way, is where I learned this from, if you're watching. And so learning for people that government has only failed because it has been failed by people who don't actually believe in this stuff is a powerful story to tell people, even if saying, well, actually, we just spend however much we want, maybe is harder to tell to the public, even though it is basically true. And not just true from like a theoretical standpoint, it's written into statute that the government has a central account that spends money, and that account gets zeroed at the end of every day from the Treasury, from taxable revenue, or from issued bonds, right? Like, it is the function via the statute of how we've set up our monetary system that the government spends money first and then taxes it back. But that's a difficult story to tell. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I don't disagree with any of that. And I think it's absolutely true that it is a powerful story to say, look, we're spending money on the wealthiest in society, and that's why you're not getting any money. That was basically the 2017 pitch, for the many, not the few. It's a good story, and definitely the easiest story to sell. And I'm not for one second saying they shouldn't go down this route. Absolutely not. Because at the end of the day, I'm interested in winning, and trying to reframe the entire economy in order for the Greens to win is a lot harder than maybe the Greens saying, look, we're just going to do this sort of left-wing Doge. I'm just sort of bearing on the side of caution that this potentially could be weaponized by the right wing, as everything is. But what you're saying is absolutely true. I mean, sort of related, but when we go to like Liz Truss and her sort of tax cut stuff, I often say it's an unfunded tax cut, and people say to me, hold on a second, you're saying the economy is not like a household budget, how can you say that it's an underfunded tax cut? And the thing is though, and this relates to currency, it's not necessarily the policy issue, it's the communication issue. Had Liz Truss campaigned for government on, we're going to reduce taxes to create growth. I don't believe in that policy, but she went to the City of London and said, this is what I'm going to do. This is going to boost growth. Then investor confidence wouldn't be as bad, but she basically wrote that policy on a weekend. Just the same way in John McDonnell, if I remember correctly, in 2017, he went to the City of London and said, we're going to raise your taxes, but don't worry, it's going to go on to public services. We're going to have a better economy. And a lot of people seem to think that the way markets and investors view these things is based on policy rather than communication. I mean, there was a wobble with Rachel Reeves when people thought she was going to go. And the government response was, well, Rachel Reeves is obviously really good because the fact that she might go, investors started getting worried. It wasn't because of Rachel Reeves, it's because investors were thinking, we may have an entirely different shadow chancellor and we don't know what's going to happen. So communication is key, and that's how you can bypass a lot of the issues surrounding currency. Now, to caveat that, again, modern monetary theory is such a big project that I'm not saying we should ignore international markets and currency. MMT does say that, but again, that's a long-term strategy. I think what I'm saying is, I think Zach's work on saying one thing, and then you've got this think tank saying something slightly different. There could be a potential sort of chasm there, I don't know, that Zach's saying we don't have a household budget or economy, and then Vedant saying, no, we need to be clever with money. Again, I don't want to poop on a political project because political projects are, they live and die on messaging and whether people buy into it. And I don't want to stand in that way. Again, whatever works, what wins, I'm for. But I also think we can have a conversation parallel to this saying, we don't necessarily have to lean into left-wing DOGE, but I completely understand why they're doing it. And the policies that underpin it, brilliant. I mean, we all hate privatization. We're spending more money on privatization. That wheelie bin story, these private companies, they love the fact that they're getting paid loads of money to do absolutely nothing. And that's another example in which politicians are exporting their expertise to the market.
I do. I think I can understand your framework there. Do you want to go to one of the last comments in chat here, which is from Len McBain with a £5 super chat, who says, my word, that Curtis chap is quite the gem. I say we should have him on with greater regularity, though pray tell this to keep his own channel. I guess I'd hand over to you for that one, Curtis.
Well, I agree with Len McBain. Yes, so of course I'm the founder of Turn Left Media. We have a great relationship here at Novara, and I love coming on the show. And it's wonderful co-hosting with you. But yeah, thank you, Len, for your lovely comment, and appreciate you sending £5 to Novara Media. You can support us, but also support Novara Media. It's really important because independent media, we're the ones that are taking on the oligarchs and the billionaires.
It's very, very true. It's very, very true. Mostly because we're not owned by oligarchs and billionaires. We are indeed a non-profit in terms of how we distribute the finances in the company. And that is what is important, that we do not have anyone that we answer to when it comes to our reporting. You know that when you're watching Novara Media, you're getting our unfiltered opinions, regardless of what anyone in the billionaire mainstream press might think. Mark Zuckerberg just can't stop losing. Mere days after a court in the US ordered Meta to pay $375 million for misleading users over child safety, the company has lost another landmark legal case. This time, a jury in Los Angeles has ruled that both Meta and YouTube deliberately built their social media platforms to be addictive. The 20-year-old plaintiff, known as Kaylee, will be awarded $6 million, or roughly £4.5 million in damages on the grounds that using the platforms harmed her mental health. This was how her lawyer reacted to the victory.
If the jury had returned a no, the champagne corks would be popping in the boardrooms of Google and Meta. But instead, Mark Zuckerberg has to take a phone call. And the only thing he's waiting for now is to find out if there are going to be punishment damages.
And that is the thing that's right, is that the reason why we're in this position where social media are have these addicted algorithms, right? We have these addictive social media algorithms because it's good for profit, right? They'd be popping champagne corks in the boardrooms, not just because they would have not had to pay out in these court cases, right? But they would also be popping champagne corks for the future revenue, that the fact that they are essentially colonizing people's time. This is a reference to Bo Burnham, by the way, talking about how in the old times used to colonize land, but that's all been done now. The social media companies know that the currency that you're trading in is time that you are spending having adverts targeted towards you. Anytime you are not addicted to your screen viewing their social media application specifically is time that you could be spending on a competitor. That's what they're fighting you for. And so if they don't keep you addicted coming back to those same feeds, targeting those same adverts at you, first of all, it's bad because they can't keep you engaged to the point at which they know what better ads to target you with. But also, they'll be showing you fewer adverts and making you less money. And there's only a certain amount of time everyone has available where they could or couldn't be looking at their phones. And what's frustrating, I find, is that so much of the discussion about social media bans for under 16, under 18s or whatever, regardless of the efficacy of what you think of those plans or not, whether or not that you think that the state should be coming and interacting with the private market in this way, or whether or not that you think that more should be done on the front end, lots of the discussion is around the technology of the phone, as if the phone itself is the problem, rather than the incentive structure by allowing these giant multinationals, like supranationals, something that are bigger than whole countries, decide how your children interact with the internet, rather than yourself or parents or indeed local communities or even the state, given how large these countries are. When it is not the actual technology that's the problem, the scientists and the engineers who make the mobile phones, who make our computers, who make all of the wonderful pieces of technology that make our lives easier, that decided this would be its way. It was Facebook, it was Google, it was YouTube, it was Twitter. It was all of these companies that have designed these algorithms purely on the grounds of profit. What do you think, Curtis?
Well, I'm happy the rulings happened, but maybe I'm being a bit pessimistic, but I feel like that AI and tech bros are so powerful that I don't know if this is going to be a wider sort of anti-tech bro movement. Interestingly, that Sora app, it's an app which is basically all AI-generated content creation, has shut down because Disney's pulled their funding, because I think AI is a bubble. At the end of the day, AI companies are selling a product to people that they don't want. And I think in order for companies to get people to use AI, it's to basically force them to use it. Now, how does this leak into social media? Well, it's all sort of the same thing. I read this book, I'm sure loads of people read it, is the Inshitification book by Cory Doctorow. Fantastic book again. I'm plugging loads of books tonight. Really good book. And within it, and it's been documented, that Instagram knows when you take loads of selfies and delete them off your phone. And they will send beauty products to you via ads, because basically the algorithm has worked out this person might be self-conscious. They might not be happy with the way they look. They might be a target for ads. And there will be people who will look at this and say, well, why is it the social media owners' fault that people get addicted and depressed with these things, right? And I kind of use the pub analogy, which is that someone sells alcohol and we don't sue everyone who does something bad when they're drunk, right? But the difference is, like, when someone gets drunk and does a bad thing, that's a bug, not a feature. Whereas social media platforms are quite literally designed to keep you addicted, to keep you doom scrolling. And that is a feature, not a bug. It's embedded in social media algorithms to do that, which is why I think it's a landmark ruling. Do I think it's going to be a broader anti-social media movement? I don't know. But there is a very, very big issue with social media. And you're right. It's not the technology. It's not the phone. It's the AI bros and the oligarchs who are using social media to enrich themselves, to keep you addicted. And if we had ownership in the commons, I would feel much more comfortable and you would have better results from it. And I think you would, it doesn't mean you get rid of addiction from social media entirely, but when the premise of social media is to do that, this is just what the customer's being sold. And it's not their fault, obviously, but that is what they're designed to do.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think, and it doesn't just go to the social media realm as well. Like Stephanie Sterling's done a lot of work on how this works in video games too. Like they have these really kind of addictive costs of video game monetization deliberately to try and get you hooked to keep spending. And it reminds me a lot of the gambling industry, which has had to have heavy, heavy regulations on it to ensure that the state protects people from what can happen when you get a gambling addiction. And the fact that we've taken so long to look at those same kind of incentive structures and those same kind of dynamics, social dynamics between people and social media, in my mind, quite a large misstep. Thank you very much, Curtis, for joining me tonight.
Oh, brilliant show tonight. Very much enjoyed it. And thank you for having me on again.
It was always a pleasure to have you with us. And thanks everyone at home for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.